I wish there could be an invention that bottled up the memory like perfume, and it never faded, never got stale. And then whenever I wanted to, I could uncork the bottle and live the memory all over again.
And what particular moment in your young life would you want to keep?
Oh, all of them, all these last few days. I feel as though I'd collected a whole shelf full of bottles.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today I'm joined by Dr. Suzanne Simard, a leading forest ecologist, professor, and author of the Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest. Welcome to the show today.
Thanks, Scott. It's nice to be here.
Absolutely. So you grew up in British Columbia, where logging has been a major industry. And I wonder how that experience affected you and really changed the trajectory of your life, even at an early age.
Yeah, well, I grew up in the forest. I grew up in the inland rainforests of British Columbia, which are just west of the Rocky Mountains. And these are really in a wet, productive forest. So there's huge cedar trees, huge hemlocks, huge white pines. And my family, I came from a family of horse loggers. And so I just grew up around this horse logging. And my great-grandfather, my grandfather, my uncles, my dad, they all were part of this, of this team that logged, selectively logged in those mountains. And so, yeah, it was just part of me. I didn't really know any different. So I was a kid of the forest.
Now, I think it's important to note that logging in itself, I think, doesn't have to be necessarily bad, right? I think, to your point, you come from a generation of loggers, and of course, it's a means to an end. And I think if it's done sustainably, it can be viable, correct?
Yeah, my grandfather, for example, every day they would go out to do the logging of the day, and he would map out the area and pick the few trees that they would fell. That's called selective logging. So just taking, the odd tree and just taking what they needed. And those forests, then what that does is it creates gaps in the forest that then naturally regenerate, and they just keep regenerating. And all these forests are adapted to disturbances, small and larger scale disturbances. And so that kind of logging is sustainable. And there are all these different techniques. We call them regeneration methods. Some people call them logging methods, but there's all different ways you can selectively take trees out that foster regeneration. And that's kind of quite different than the paradigm that happens now, which is to clear cut, take everything, and then replant those forests to seedlings. So not relying so much on natural regeneration and the old trees to help the forest recover, but to basically make a clean slate, take all the trees out. I mean, all the soils and plants are still there, unless they get rid of those plants, and then they're repopulated with species that are wanted by the industry. And so that's where we can get into a bit of trouble, is if that those old trees, leaving a few of those old trees actually helps the recovery of the system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we're going to come back to that in just a few minutes. And I think this is a great transition to talk about why should we think about trees differently?
Well, so, when I started in the forest industry, and which is when I was in my early 20s, when I was 20, I got my degree in forestry and I started working for a forest company. And the method of logging, the regeneration method, was clear cutting and planting trees. And so those old forests, the old growth forests that they harvested, were very different than the plantations that they're establishing. And this is still the practice today, where the original forest is very diverse. It's very rich. It's full of deep carbon in the soil. The trees are full of carbon. They have structures that are and diversity that cycles nutrients and water and cleans our air and cleans the water and regulates water flow, for example. Whereas the plantations, they've basically changed the forest from a very diverse place to a simplified plantation. And in that process, there's also a big attention to the plants that are viewed as competitors to the trees that are planted. And so often those are removed using herbicides or with manual cutting methods. And that practice itself also goes further to simplify the forest more. And so what we're seeing is that simplification has got some there's some unexpected, or maybe we shouldn't say unexpected, there are some side effects of that, which could easily be rectified, in my view, if we leave some old trees and we foster more natural regeneration that might accompany the planting.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So again, I want to come back to the kind of the current methods and some of the best practices that you recommend based on your research. But let's learn a little bit about the tree systems. One of the things based on your research, you indicate that trees actually communicate with one another in terms of the underground systems via the fungi as well as the roots. Can you tell us a little bit more? And you go as far as saying that they are able to actually learn, evolve, and perceive one another, and even remember the past, as well as even compete and cooperate with one another.
Yeah. So, our original, or when I went to forestry school, we learned that trees were, individuals, and that they are striving to compete for as many resources as they can get as individuals. And that includes light, water, and nutrients, so they can grow tall and big. And the idea being in the forest industry is then we can cut and get bigger trees and get them sooner. And that anything that can be done to accelerate that process of growing big trees quickly is a good model. And what I learned is actually that these trees are not actually discrete they are individual trees, but they're connected below ground by these mycorrhizal fungi. And mycorrhizas are these symbiotic fungi that associate with trees, and all trees all over the world require these relationships, where the tree provides photosynthate, or energy, for the fungus to then grow through the soil and pick up water and nutrients for the tree, and it basically brings it back to the tree and exchanges it for them. And what I learned too, and others around the world have also made these discoveries, that trees can be linked together by certain fungal species, that even different species of trees can be linked together. And these serve as avenues for the movement of resources and the transmission of information, and what I call the ability for trees to communicate with each other or develop relationships with each other, which, if you think about trees and forests, they live for hundreds of years side by side. They can't move. And so they've evolved all these methods of interacting with each other that includes this method of communication below ground.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, because in some ways the fungi, the microbiomes that you're referring to, have this capability, almost like a chemical neurotransmitter, in the sense that the root system is a large neural net, and these fungi are able to then transmit not only data, but nutrients, information, as well as other things that's needed. And it's interesting because you're talking about not just between the same species of trees, but different species of trees, how they can actually communicate as well.
Yeah.
So very interesting.
Yeah. Well, so the pattern of the network in the soil, we discovered, or we were able to describe that pattern working in a Douglas fir forest that is actually is predominantly Douglas fir with some aspen and a few other species. but I wanted to work with a predominantly single species forest, because then would be easier for us to map this network. So we didn't work with these complex mixtures of different species to start with. But what we figured out when we were mapping this network between Douglas fir, which were of all different ages, that they formed what is the pattern is what is called a biological neural network. And that pattern is that there are hubs or certain points, or in this case big old trees that were the hubs of the network. They're the center points of the network, and the reason that they are the center points is that they're big, they have lots of photosynthetic capacity, and they have huge root systems with many points of potential contact with other trees. And so those many points of contact means that there's a constellation of trees all around them that they connect with. And then the smaller trees just form smaller nodes within that overall network. And that pattern where you've got a few large nodes and smaller nodes that are, of lesser abundance, that is a classic pattern of a complex network or a neural network. And it turns out that these chemicals that move through the network, they include carbon and nitrogen in amino acids, and the main one that moves through the network is called glutamate. And glutamate is actually also a neurotransmitter in our own human biology, in our own nervous systems. And so that's interesting that, that these chemicals are conserved. They're the same chemicals, but they, obviously have different, there's differences in the biology in that the forest doesn't actually have a brain. It has this fungal neural network that's shaped like a neural network, but it transmits messages as though neurotransmitters, using a kind of a similar methodology and similar patterns. And I find that fascinating because these systems have evolved for these efficiencies and patterns that work well.
I find this conversation so fascinating because I think many times when we think about deforestation or forest issues, we think about what's happening on the top, but there's so much complexities and wealth of information that's happening at the root system level. So this is really fascinating. In just a few minutes, I'm going to come back to your book, Finding the Mother Tree, which I think you started to allude to a little bit. But I want to go back to some of the earlier points around the current industry practices around essentially, cutting everything, keeping it monoculture, and creating essentially this kind of the single crop harvest type of a plantation model. How much harder would it for a large commercial entity to do some of the selective cutting that you're referring to that has regenerative capabilities by leaving some of the older trees there while selectively choosing to cut down others?
Yeah.
You may also like our quarterly Ask Your Perkins event that brings some of the most notable experts and category-leading startups in their area of sustainability and human survival on Earth and in space. To register, visit astroperkins.com/events.
It is a little bit more work. It takes a little more ingenuity. It takes more skill, but it's definitely possible. And people have been doing these kinds of selective harvests in Europe and in North America, and for hundreds of years, selectively taking out individual trees. And so it's not like it's a technology that's new to us. It's not rocket science. It just takes care and time. And actually, I feel like it's a whole skill set that people can develop, right, or redevelop, or that we've kind of forgotten in some ways, but people can learn how to do this fairly quickly and become craftspeople at this, craftsmen, and basically, be more surgical and more strategic in how the forest is harvested. One of the consequences of doing this is that it doesn't, is that there's more trees standing at the end, right, instead of a big cleared football field, if you want to think of it that way. It's a land base that's got like clusters of trees all through it, and they provide seed, and they provide all these networks that seedlings can establish in, so they naturally regenerate quite easily. And so one of the things that the industry might say is, well, maybe we should, if we're going to selectively leave trees or selectively take out a few trees, we're going to have to cut more area. And that is one of the arguments, is that, we're just going to cut more over a bigger area, which from a biodiversity point of view isn't necessarily the best thing, because we also need to conserve patches of forest intact for their genetic diversity and biodiversity and so on. And so as a consequence, we actually have to it has to be a deeper decision-making process, where we have to, not cut more area, actually cut the same area, or, just take out fewer trees. And when the trees that we do take out, take more value from them, do more with them. Like right now in Canada, for example, most of what those wood products are turned into are pulp and paper and 2x4s. And those are very low value products. If we make more finer products like furniture, like IKEA makes, for example, more craftsman like products, we can sell them for a higher price and employ more people. And then you can cut fewer trees and make just as much money from them. And in Canada, for example, we employ much fewer people and make much less dollar value per cubic meter cut than say compared to Sweden. And so we'd have to make that kind of market-based shift in order to not disturb a bigger land base in the pursuit of selective harvesting.
I think you make some great arguments, as well as some potential use of economics and models. I wanted to kind of explore this notion of bottom line. So for logging and lumber companies, what's going to allow for them to rethink their approach is essentially that bottom line, right? So by having selective harvesting, can you actually show data that they can actually, in the long run, actually end up harvesting more trees, and that trees regenerate faster?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And there's, I could answer it in various ways, but the most simple way to say this is that, our forests right now and into the future are not going to be the same as the forests in the past. And the reason is that our climate is changing, right? Forests are largely, shaped a lot by climate. And as the climate heats up, as precipitation patterns change, the forests are undergoing a great deal of stress. And so, we're starting to see those stresses. And one of the big indicators in Canada, at least, is that our forests have shifted from being a carbon sink to a carbon source on the global stage. And that is because of the decline of the forest, right? It's partly because of disturbance as well, more fires, more clear cutting, more oil and gas exploration, but also just the diebacks of forests. And so how can we mitigate that? Like, how can we reduce that stress? Well, we can, we need to mitigate climate change, slow it down, not be, sending so much CO2 into the atmosphere via fossil fuels or land use change. So we can change that side of the equation, like take less, use less fossil fuels, move to more renewable energy sources. On the other side of the equation is what's coming up next. What's the regenerating forest looking like? And if you mix species in diverse communities and also migrate genotypes from warmer climates that are pre-adapted to the warming conditions, and also have these old trees around them, you can actually, and what our data is showing is that we create more diverse forests with more trees that are growing faster. And so with these techniques, leaving old trees, fostering natural regeneration, moving genotypes, allowing a more natural cycle of regeneration and growth, that I think that we can actually create more productive forests than we are doing right now. We just have to do better silviculture practices. And we know how to do it. We definitely know how to do it.
And I think what you just summarized really is kind of the synopsis for the finding the mother tree, discovering the wisdom of the forest. And again, there you put a lot of emphasis around this notion of mother trees and how they connect and sustain others. And exactly to your point, really provides a biodiversity and effectively makes it much more resilient to whatever conditions it may be, so that we can actually have better carbon sequestration, as well as the oxygen that it generates.
Yes.
A few more insights from the book that we haven't discussed.
Do you want me to just
Yes.
talk about that? Yeah.
Just a few.
Well, so in the book, I talk about like the discovery of how I came to name and discover the importance of these big old trees in ecosystems. And we talked about how they're connected to, or when seeds fall on the forest floor, those seedlings germinate, they establish right in the network of these old trees. And that network is basically a legacy from the previous forest, or the forest that is being harvested or disturbed. And so those seedlings, or the seeds falls, it germinates, and the roots tap into the network right away, or within a month or two, and then they actually are able to access all the resources that big network already is accessing for the big trees. It's kind of like being born into a family with knowledge and wisdom and love already. The child benefits from that family already. And so that's what these seedlings are establishing in this beautiful network already. And that helps them survive. So they survive much better than if they don't have that network. And they also receive some water and nutrients and carbon from these old trees. And so they really get this really good head start in their life, and well established. And they have nice broad root systems that are, able to withstand all kinds of stresses because they're being helped along by these old neighbors. And this is the crux of the idea of keeping these old trees, is to help these new generations of trees get a head start. And so they don't just get resources, they also get other information from these old trees. For example, these old trees, if they're under stress, they will actually pass on information about that stress. And those seedlings then are able to adjust their biochemistry, and they produce more defense compounds and enzymes like monoterpenes and defense enzymes that helps them withstand those stresses in their lives. And so they actually get this, genetic information from these trees in real time through this network. And then they're able to, do better in their lives, and then pass on that wisdom to the next generations and so on. And that is a very important adaptive ability of forests, is that they're able to transmit this real information about stresses that happened in the past, and helps them to deal with them in the future. These old trees, the other important message about these old trees is not only do they help regeneration, they also store huge amounts of carbon. Mm-hmm. And so, saving these old forests, not just old trees, but even intact old forests is really important from a carbon sequestration and storage point of view, in meeting our carbon commitments to the world, to the Paris Agreement, and so on. We really do need to keep these old trees alive, and their ability to take up and store carbon is huge. We can't replace that very easily if we cut them all down and replace them with little seedlings, because it takes decades, if not centuries, for them to catch up to where those old trees were. So they're really important from that point of view. The other really important reason they're important to keep around is that, there's diversity in their genes. There's in the seeds that they produce. And so those seeds are actually hold a record of previous climatic conditions that then help, through the genetic makeup, that help the seedlings cope with future fluctuations in climate as well. So diversity is a huge part of it. Genetic, also species diversity. These old trees and old forests actually are scaffoldings for a diversity of fungi and lichens and algae and bacteria, epiphytes, all kinds of creatures that live on and depend on these old trees.
So again, I think the arguments that you make for these older mother trees is very compelling. I guess the question that I would ask is, in parts of the rainforest in, let's say, South America or British mm-hmm. Columbia, or even Indonesia or Southeast Asia, mm-hmm. where those areas have been cleared already, and perhaps maybe they've started to grow the next generation of seedlings. Mm-hmm. How should they address those kind of canvas plantations where they don't have these legacy older trees?
Mm.
Don't forget to visit astroperkins.com to register for our next quarterly events. Past and current speakers include Julianne Hough, actress, dancer, and winner of Dancing with the Stars; Damian Vaughn, former NFL player; Neil Gregory, Chief Thought Leadership Officer at the IFC World Bank; and many more. To register, visit astorperkins.com and click on Events.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, so for one, there are a lot of new forests. There's a lot of new plantations. There's also a lot of old forest still left, and that old forest is and I'm going to keep emphasizing this at how crucial it is for us to conserve and protect those old forests because of the carbon and biodiversity storehouses that they are. They're hotspots, and it doesn't grow back quickly. Like these plantations, they don't have that. They've lost a large part of that carbon already, at least half of the total ecosystem carbon. We know that clear cut and conversion to plantations is one of the main reasons why we've lost so much biodiversity. And so in the plantations that are coming up, what we should be trying to do is restore some of those functions. And how do we do that? We can do that by fostering diversity in the plantations themselves. And what does that mean? It means that in our cultivation practices, in some cases, in a lot of cases, we're really, really aggressive with that, right? We, like in the Southern Pine region or in the slash and burn areas of the Amazon or even in the mountains of British Columbia, we put a lot of emphasis on, growing these fast growing trees or in simple plantations. And then even in some cases, adding fertilizers and herbicides and in some areas, even irrigation. And those are not very sustainable systems. And in shifting them to these sort of more that require these inputs to keep them going, you lose the natural resilience of those ecosystems. And so I think trying to foster the natural diversity amongst those planted trees would really help them, right? You can foster the establishment of nitrogen fixing plants, for example, that will add nitrogen naturally. You can foster, the development of mycorrhizal fungal networks so they can get phosphorus naturally from the soil ecosystem. And so, so there are definitely ways by keeping the native plant community intact around these trees that would be super helpful in increasing the resilience of those new plantations.
Yeah, I want to go back to our early discussion around market forces and economics and how, in many ways, I mean, even this clear-cut plantations that you're referring to, so much of it's driven by just not only basic economics, but almost like myopic thinking of, how do I profit maximize in the nearest term versus the longer term and some of the additional benefits that they can gain if it was more biodiverse. And then at the time of the recording of this particular interview, we've seen the rise of, let's call it timber or wood, to skyrocket because of scarcity issues. So that's putting a lot more pressure to log more trees. Mm-hmm. So based on, again, going back to the market forces, and you mentioned premium products, but other levers that we need to think about that will help the industry to better understand, better rationalize.
Yeah, for sure. Like our marketplace is really simple when it comes to ecosystems and ecology. It's short term. It's based on products that we value on the marketplace, that we've assigned monetary value to, like 2x4s and pulp and paper. But there are these other existential values of forests. So we talked about how they provide us with oxygen. They provide us with clean water. They provide us their carbon storehouses. And we have not valued those. We've taken it for granted, right? It's just been free to us. It's like a public good. And what we need to do is put a price on those values if we're going to keep the same market tools that we have in place, which probably we are. I don't see any big shifts in economic theory happening right now. But if we're going to fit within the current economic model of supply and demand and infinite growth, then we need to value those parts of the ecosystem that we haven't normally put a value on. So putting a price on carbon is one thing. And I think that that is actually a really good umbrella for all these other values we're talking about, these other ecosystem goods and services. It just is really fortuitous. It's really great that actually carbon storage or carbon stocks are correlated with biodiversity basically around the world, that diverse forests are also huge carbon storehouses. They are also where we get our headwaters for clean water. So if we can put a price on carbon, it would serve as a kind of an umbrella for all these other values as well. And so that is an alternative market tool that I think we can use, instead of valuing it just based on, the 2x4. Well, dollars per ton of carbon is another value mechanism that will easily fit into our market system. And so then how do you do that? How does the marketplace drive that? Well, I mean, I think if we make people pay for their pollution, right? And carbon dioxide is a pollutant, then and put a price on that carbon dioxide for emitting it into the air, then suddenly it's less attractive to pay that cost. But we can also, people can pay for also keeping forests in the ground to maybe offset if they are going to emit, if they are going to be a polluter, they can offset carbon storage by paying to keep old forests in the ground. So there are tools out there. They're definitely not perfect. They need to be worked on. There's all kinds of issues, even with carbon offsets and carbon pricing, but it is the way to start. It's the economic tool to start with, because we have that economic system. It's not going to change anytime soon, not in the short term that we need it to, which we've got to act very quickly, from a climate change point of view. We only have another, decade or so to make these changes. So those are tools, and I think that they're valuable. I think if we really put our minds to it, we can make it work.
All right, so we're out of time. And with that, we've been joined by Dr. Suzanne Simard, Professor of Forest Ecology and author. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks, Scott.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.